In the small town of Cedar Falls, Ohio, there stood a rusty old garage at the end of Miller Street. The sign above the door read Walt's Auto Repair, but most people in town just called it the junkyard shop. Its owner, Walt Higgins, was a stocky man in his 50s with grease-stained hands and a limp he had carried since a factory accident 20 years ago. Kids in town whispered that he talked to engines like they were old friends. Grown men laughed behind his back, calling him the junk mechanic, because his garage was always cluttered with broken parts, rusted tools, and machines nobody else wanted. What nobody knew was that before the accident, Walt had worked for 12 years as a propulsion technician at a small aerospace contractor outside Dayton. He had left that world quietly after his injury, choosing to disappear into a simple life fixing pickup trucks and lawnmowers. He never spoke about his past. He didn't need anyone's approval. He simply loved machines, and machines, in turn, seemed to trust him. One rainy Tuesday morning, a black SUV pulled up outside Walt's garage. 3 people stepped out: a tall woman in a grey blazer named Dr. Susan Carter, a younger man carrying a laptop bag named Marcus Webb, and an older man with silver hair named Dr. Raymond Poole. They were engineers from a NASA research facility 2 hours away, and they looked completely out of place standing in the mud outside Walt's shop. "Are you Walter Higgins?" Dr. Carter asked, glancing at a folder in her hand. Walt wiped his hands on a rag and nodded slowly. "That's me. Something wrong with your truck?" Dr. Poole stepped forward. "Not exactly. We were told you might be able to help us with something a little more unusual." Walt raised an eyebrow. "I fix cars, trucks, tractors. That's about it." Walt's face went still for a moment. He hadn't heard the name Halbrook Aerospace spoken out loud in almost 15 years. "That was a long time ago," he said quietly. "I don't do that kind of work anymore." Dr. Carter didn't back down. "We've spent 3 weeks and a lot of money trying to solve this. We are not asking you to redesign anything, Mr. Higgins. We just want you to look at it. 10 minutes of your time." Walt looked at the 3 of them standing awkwardly in his cluttered garage, surrounded by old tires and a half-disassembled engine block. Something in Dr. Poole's tired eyes reminded him of himself, years ago, staring at a problem that refused to make sense. He sighed and wiped his hands again. "Bring it in." Set it on the bench. Finally, Walt spoke. "Your seal is fine. Your wiring is fine. Your metal's fine too. But look here." He pointed to a small joint where 2 different materials met. "You've got titanium bonded to a nickel alloy sleeve. Under normal stress, that's not a problem. But you said this fails under thermal stress, right? Rapid heating and cooling." "Yes," Marcus said, leaning in. "It cycles fast, simulating orbital transitions." Walt nodded. "That's your answer. Titanium and nickel alloy expand and contract at different rates. Every time this thing heats and cools fast, the bond at this joint gets stressed just a little more. It's not a design flaw exactly. It's a fatigue problem. You won't see it in a static test, only in a cycling test, and only after enough repetitions build up. Your simulations probably treat this joint as a single uniform material instead of 2 bonded metals. That's why the models don't catch it. Because nobody looked at it as 2 different metals fighting each other," Walt said simply. "Machines don't lie. They just don't always tell you the truth in words you're expecting." Dr. Carter stared at him for a long moment. "Mr. Higgins, would you be willing to come in and consult with our team? Just for this project. We'd pay you well, obviously." Walt looked around his garage, at the oil-stained floor and the old radio playing static in the corner, at the life he had built quietly for himself. Then he looked at the valve on the table, and for the first time in years, he felt something stir in his chest, something like the old excitement he used to feel solving real problems that mattered. "I've got customers," he said. "Mrs. Delgado's car needs an oil change Thursday." Marcus smiled. "We can work around your schedule." Walt was quiet for a moment longer, then finally nodded. "All right. I'll take a look at your project. But I'm not moving to Houston or wherever your facility is. I do this from here, or I don't do it at all." Dr. Poole extended his hand. "Deal." That night, after the engineers drove off in their black SUV, Walt sat alone in his garage for a long time. He pulled an old cardboard box down from a high shelf, blowing a layer of dust off the lid. Inside were photographs from his years at Halbrook Aerospace. Young Walt in a clean lab coat, standing beside a test rig with a wide grin on his face. There was a photo of his old supervisor, a man named Gerald Finch, shaking his hand after they solved a fuel line problem that had stumped the whole department for weeks. Walt hadn't looked at these pictures in over a decade. He had boxed up that part of himself the same week he left the hospital, telling himself that a man with a permanent limp had no business chasing rockets anymore. Looking at the photos now, he realized he hadn't lost the gift. He had just stopped using it. The next morning, Mrs. Delgado came in for her oil change, right on schedule. Walt worked under her car exactly as he always had, humming along to the radio, joking with her about her grandson's baseball season. Nothing about his daily life changed. But something inside him had shifted, quietly and permanently, like a gear finally clicking back into place after years of sitting idle. Over the following weeks, Marcus began visiting the garage twice a week with updated data and printouts. At first, some of the younger engineers on the NASA team resented the idea of relying on a small-town mechanic they had never met in person. They assumed Dr. Poole was exaggerating, or that Walt had simply gotten lucky with one observation. But when Walt caught a second flaw, this time in the mounting bracket's tolerance specifications, their skepticism faded fast. He explained his reasoning patiently, using terms mixed with everyday language, comparing thermal expansion to the way a screen door swells and sticks in summer heat. It was simple. It was correct. And it worked. Word spread through Cedar Falls fast, the way it always does in small towns. Within a week, everyone knew that NASA engineers had driven 2 hours just to visit Walt's garage. The same people who used to snicker about the junk mechanic started showing up with questions, apologies, and sudden respect. Walt didn't gloat. He kept fixing trucks and tractors during the day, and in the evenings, he sat at his workbench sketching solutions for the valve assembly, sending notes back to the research team through Marcus's laptop. 3 months later, the redesigned valve passed every thermal cycling test without a single failure. Dr. Carter called Walt personally to tell him the news. "You saved us a year of work," she said. "Maybe more." Walt just smiled and said, "Glad the old brain still works." The story eventually made it into a small feature in the local paper, and later a short segment on regional news. The headline read almost exactly what the town used to whisper as an insult. They called him a junk mechanic until NASA engineers walked into his garage. But underneath the words was a photo of Walt standing proudly in his cluttered shop, surrounded by tools he had used his whole life, finally recognized not for what people assumed about him, but for what he had always truly been. Walt never changed the sign above his door. It still read Walt's Auto Repair, rusted letters and all. But now, when people in Cedar Falls passed by, they didn't see a junk mechanic anymore. They saw a man who had quietly carried her extraordinary skill through ordinary days, waiting patiently for the right problem to walk through his door. Years later, when a local schoolteacher asked Walt to speak to her class about following your dreams, he shrugged off the idea of any grand lesson. "I didn't chase anything," he told the kids, leaning against a workbench covered in wrenches. "I just kept showing up and paying attention, even when nobody else thought it mattered." Turns out, that's usually enough. The children didn't fully understand what he meant that day, but the teacher did, and so did everyone else in Cedar Falls who remembered the man they had once dismissed as nothing more than a junk mechanic.